I was thinking as I was thinking about how have been struck over the years for many, many, many years, long before we met, by the way you use really simple, you use lists, you use like, you stack a lot of simple things to add them up to create this like profound meaning in your work. Um, and it's such a stunning and deceptively simple thing that you do. Um, and I'm such a huge fan of it. And I wondered sort of if that is a conscious approach. Do you do that simplification? Do you get some tangled, complicated thing and then, pare it down to its pieces?
Um, First of all, thank you. That's very kind, and the feeling is wildly mutual, as a longtime admirer of your work. Um, I don't think I consciously think, "Oh, this is complicated and let's make it simple." Um, Usually, if I need a question to be guiding me when I'm writing, it's what's happening. And what's happening is oftentimes very complicated, but can
Right.
exist in manageable bites. And so really it's about, okay, can I be clear on this line about what I mean? And I feel no faith to that line to reassure me about something in the next line. If that, you know what I mean? Like, contradictions abound.
Right.
And in so many ways, that's a part of living. And so, I think it's hard to tell. Like, it varies on what kind of poem you're trying to write. But for instance, if I'm writing a narrative poem um, that's about a story, then really it's about what happened, what happened emotionally, as told by the details in the story. Does that make I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
Yes, you are absolutely.
I just think what's happening is such a layered answer always that it's an easier goal than how can I communicate this, or how can I make this complicated thing simple, or like the work wants to be understood. What you're writing wants to be understood. And so
Yeah.
it really is about patience almost, and uh trying to name something that is really hard to name. I don't Yeah.
Yeah. And you ran a workshop for us and you regularly run a series. I know a lot of folks, including myself, have gained so much from these workshops, the Emotional Historians series. Um, is run like, I think, unlike any other workshop that I've been to, in the way that you sort of hold community and also celebrate poetry broadly, right? It's not just like we're here to do this work, but it's also like we're here to celebrate the fact of poetry, the experience of poetry, our even to celebrate our own individual connections to poetry, right? It's very celebratory um, and referential. And I love the name of it, emotional historians, as this idea of like there's this alternate history that we're keeping, um, that we're recording. Can you talk about like where that name comes from? Like what it, I know what it has meant to me, but
Yeah. um I think that when I first thought of that as a concept of emotional history, um there were I'm thinking of one loss in particular in my life where the a family member had passed away, and he had really gotten into songwriting. He'd always been like a guitar player, but had gotten into songwriting in the later years of his life. And how, in the wake of that loss, how lucky those who were in his immediate family, those who were in his distant family, were to have his music, because it felt like, obviously different than having a conversation with him, but it felt uh, like he was there, right? And
Yeah.
so that was my first, I think, concrete lesson that people are, when they're making genuine art, which is of course subjective, but what I find myself gravitating towards is people just like really making art that they're in. And so, a lot of us who loved him had his art, and it was a way of spending time with him. So I was like, okay, if everybody has the capacity to be rooted in your art, then you leave a part of who you are inside of each thing that you make. And in doing so, you are a historian. And it's not really on you to decide who that's important to,
Right.
because there are people who that's deeply important to their siblings and to their loved ones. And there are people whose emotional history is impactful for millions of people, right? Like think about like the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, or any album that you love that
Right.
has, that's so clearly that person put themselves in that album.
Right.
Um, uh, and you just, in that, you are in Lauryn Hill's um, love relationships in that
Mhm.
album. And they exist. And it's not to say they won't change immediately after release is released. And that's part of what's so exciting about it, is that it's this snapshot in time when you make a piece of art that says, look, that's where I was. And I feel that way about so many of my poems, where I'm like, wow, that was written by a different person.
Mhm.
But I can track myself through them in ways that I can't through photographs. And honestly, that I can't even through like times and dates and who I shared space with. I feel like there's so much more about, I don't know, who I actually am that's rooted in those poems, or who I was really.
Your poem, It's a Lot, which you so generously are allowing us to publish in We Were Not Alone, the upcoming anthology from CBAW, our very first anthology, is one of these poems that stacks up the things that are a lot and that invites people to consider. I mean, it has so many of these lines that are like, there is the line in it that is, it's a lot to attend the dentist, which like
Very true.
it's so true, but like to hear someone say it, right? To hear someone say it, and it's just that it's like it's a because you feel like shit for it being a lot, right? Like I feel like a rut. I'm often feeling, and I have felt this way for, I'm 40 years old, so for the past maybe 20 years, I have felt like a real adult would know how to do X or Y. A real adult would be able to X or Y. Um, but like in fact, it's a lot. Um, and when people who have not had any introduction to poetry are introduced to that particular poem, it just sort of opens them up. And that like this isn't going to entirely be the Jon Sands cuddle puddle hour. I'm like just like you're like oh my god, but there is this thing that happens when a poem names uh, not just the biggest griefs, but also the small griefs that I think, you know, I'm really grateful for poets and poetry that make space for like not having to name only the most tragic things. Um, there's also a line in the poem, it's a lot to not, and I might be misquoting it, to not make yourself a caricature of your sadnesses, which I think is often the impulse as we're beginning to write poetry for many people is to write around like oh this is the thing that makes a poem, right? Like the darkest things, the most tragic things, um, and it's
Yeah.
really brave to not lead with that.
Well,
uh,
we were talking a little bit at the beginning of this. Am I cutting off your question?
no, no, go ahead,
Yeah, we were
please.
talking a little bit at the beginning of this about, you know, the question being what's happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
I do think that that's a moment that exists in a lot of poems where I'm like, okay, it is a lot, but I feel myself becoming a caricature of my own sadness right here. And so the poem needs to pivot. I need to autocorrect, or not autocorrect, I need to correct, right? I need to somehow bring balance to this poem and name this other thing, right? If I'm like, okay, this is descending into becoming a caricature of my own sadness, then I'm like, it's a lot to not become a caricature, you know, of your own
Right.
sadness, right? To acknowledge the good things. And so there, that's just a, that's also happening in that moment. And so my job is to let that enter and complicate this poem, to make this poem harder to pin down in the same way that life is harder to pin down.
Yes. Yeah. And it, I think that most of us have come to poetry, have come to creative work, whatever our creative work is, out of necessity, right? Out of personal necessity, and we find some penchant for it. We find some interest in craft. We want to get better at it, and so we do, and and we make it our jobs. But this thing then for me, has been like, okay, so this dark thing brought me to writing. And so my early writing is about this dark thing because that's what I was, where the necessity was. And then growing beyond that to writing, even when I don't need to write, right? Like, need to write, to writing, um, because I'm working on craft or pushing some edge or, maybe being, adventurous and experimental in my work, but not so much like, if I do not write right now, I will die or kill, right? Like that sort of space that like maybe my early work came from in that transition, um, into not being a caricature of those things, because that is an easy place. I can go back and write about how my dad died like 100 times, right? Like it's interesting, but it's also not what's happening.
I do
Um,
feel though like a lot of your work um, is so varied. I mean, you have such range as a writer in terms of the kinds of poems that you'll allow yourself to write craft wise. But one thing that feels true, at least to me as a reader, but I would love to hear you speak on it because it's something that I really admire, is it's almost like that, you know, when you get a cut, but you're not quite bleeding and you peel that first, so you still have skin there, but it's like that lower skin that's very tender. I feel like you're always like in that space, you know, like even if you're over here, because that's life, right? So you're like, okay, I'm not going to stare directly at my largest grief right now, but your largest grief is somewhere in the scope, right? Like you never reject it or let it go. Or you never try to keep it out, right? Like, and so
right.
sometimes I feel like the emotional depth in your work enters as an image or something. Is that something that feels conscious for you, or is that something that I read it as something that you allow to happen and that your craft tools, you know, make possible in really layered and complicated ways, but maybe it's something that you pursue.
Thank you for saying that. And like, I'm still just astonished always that you read my work. Uh, but I think that, right, these things, these big things that happen to us, show up in different ways as we get different distance from them. And then it's like, well, why am I thinking about this today? Like, what about today is making this happen? And I think often about like, um, our minds put things in a certain order in our, right, like they connect things, and our job is to like figure out what those connections are and how we can keep them from fucking up the rest of our lives, right? Like quite simply, right? Like, what is it, why is this coming up for me, and what do I do with it? Because it's instructions. Because I mean, I am a poet, I am a writer, but mostly my job is to live well, and in my life and in my relationships. And so writing hopefully everything I do is kind of feeding that, whether it's, eating well or writing, or any of the work that I do.
I have one other question. I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I'm sorry. You'll allow yourself in a poem to make a very declarative statement about who you are. And I'm wondering if there are things that you feel that you're like, I need to name this in this poem so that it can be true always, or so that I've named it here and then I will become a different person from this thing that I've named, or like it's an aspect of, it's hard to ask without specific poems in
I
mind,
would,
but do you know what I mean? Where like here's an example. I wrote a poem in workshop a couple of, I think it was like 2 cycles ago, but at its core, it was about walking my dog during the winter with like salt all over the sidewalk, and just like I had forgotten his booties, and we just like didn't even have booties, and I'm like, shit, it's like early February and I still don't have like booties for my dog, with like salt, so his feet are all getting torn up and he's walking like this, and it just felt like such an epic fail to this thing that I loved, right? Like this dog who I
yeah,
loved deeply. And um and the poem ends on like the worst fucking part is, I know I'm gonna forget today and I won't get them. Like I know I'm gonna let him down, period. Right? Like that's what the poem had to land on. That's a fact. 2 days later, or not even 2 days later, later that day I got the booties, right? Like, and
right.
somehow naming in the poem that I wouldn't, that it was over, that was out. This is who I am, allowed me to do the thing in the first place. And I just feel like there are moments where you were writing about teaching where you felt particularly, the poem feels like a little, um it's the poem that, I don't want to quote it too much, but it was the one, like, to my students, like things my students don't know
Leave I'll
about me,
never
or things
say.
I won't say to my students, right?
Mhm.
And it lands in this place that the poem doesn't provide any comfort here. That's not what the poem came to
Right.
do, right? Like the poem ends with the author being like, look, I don't know. I'm not here to save you. I'm not here to do, like, this is it. And it's such an
Yes.
important moment that I, as a teacher, also recognize and know. And the poem doesn't allow that I'm going to go to sleep tonight and I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to come back to work and I'm going to find the things that I love and I will connect. But the poem doesn't answer any of that because it doesn't need to. It's just trying to name a feeling really clearly. And so that's the question, like your
Uh,
relationship to naming things in your work, and if you feel tethered to what you've named in your poems, or if you feel released from it in some way, or I don't know, like you've massaged out something that now can become something else.
I mean, that poem in particular, Things I'll Never Say to a Group of Participants. I mean, we live in a world where we filter ourselves a whole day long, right? Like, why are here? And especially when you're working in a space like, at that time I was working at Walter Reed. I mean, I was probably between Walter Reed and Fort Belvoir running 12 writing groups a week with intensive outpatient psych, inpatient psych, like all of these groups of people who were at a crisis point, right? And
People
the
who are
thing
listening
about
to this who maybe don't know this world, that is a ton. That is a lot of teaching. Go ahead.
it's a lot of hours of teaching, of being on, of holding the table steady while the whole room is shaking, right? When you're around people who are in crisis, and I think we've all done this. We've sat with a friend who's closer to a grief than we are, right? Whose partner has passed, or mother has passed. And so we sit next to them and we put aside ourselves and we exist as a shell for them, right? And when you're teaching that much in spaces where everyone's at that point of crisis, in it, like 12 people in a room, each of them is at that point in crisis. Um, you feel like, am I ever me? And so the page is the place where don't I don't lie to myself, right? Sometimes I'll read a poem I'll start reading a poem aloud and be like, oh fuck, I know what's coming. I don't want to say this aloud. But I'm, like a poem that's in a book that's in the world. Because I'm like, oh no, what have I done? Because I just, so yeah, I can't lie in a poem. And I also don't feel like if the goal in life, and I believe it is to constantly become a better version of yourself. And of course, we have our dips, but then just naturally we'll be creating versions of ourselves that aren't up to snuff. And I have accepted that. Right? Like they're and if even if they're on the page, like I'm gonna change from it. And sometimes that realization thing happens, like you said about the dog walking, like, oh, and then you
Yeah.
do it, you write it down, and then you're like, well, shit, let me order these dog booties, or let me take care of this thing.
Yeah, I mean, you're
But
also like, I can't change, like, sometimes that tension of wanting to change is so strong that you can't even name the thing as it is. And because you're like one step ahead, where you're like, okay, I'm gonna be better than this thing I won't even allow myself to fucking say. And
yeah,
so if the page is the place, um, not even it, the page is the place where you have to say it like it is. And I think releasing the expectation of feeling like my future was tethered to anything that I was writing opened me up a lot to um of course, like not being the hero or protagonist even sometimes of my poems, but also not being the villain, like uh a kind of layered space where I'm like, let me try to put this in a snapshot. um and in doing so, I feel like I think about Mahogany Brown all the time, saying that poetry isn't therapy, but it's therapeutic. Um, because there are so many moments where I'm like, well, that's a space where I can do that, and my life will benefit from it. My life will benefit from naming a complicated truth in this way that I haven't been able to do in other forums or settings. Um,
and I want to add too, though, that like writing poetry can help us realize things and make our lives better. But actually, the poem, the art making side of poetry, is about turning up the weird and turning up the volume and making it more. It is about kind of making a caricature. It's art, right? And that's a really tricky thing, particularly with memoir, where people will read a memoir and be like, it's so raw. Oh my gosh, you just like really, it was seemed so stream of consciousness. And it's like, motherfucker, no, 16 sets of eyes saw this.
Yeah, but
It's
that's
raw.
life too. Like, I don't know. I know that art turns like, oh, the tension, and we all accept that it was a 3, but then it's a 10. But in the art, and it's like, oh, I was just turning it up for the art. But that's how it feels to live inside of a body. Like, we are, there are tremendous implications to our emotional lives. And we live in a world that has uh, amassed a significant amount of violence and wealth and uh, any number of things that are rooted in things like fear and like a lack of knowing for real that we're mortal, a lack
Right.
of, I don't know, uh, being able to look at our own internal lives. And so I think sometimes that we convince ourselves that we're at a 3, and art, sometimes I'm like, let's turn this shit up to 11, but that feels more real than what actually happened on that sidewalk with me and my dog. I mean, that's a very low stakes example, but you know, sometimes you are using those craft tools to say, okay, I'm just really going to do this to try to make a point. But the point is actually what's happening inside of your body, not what you
Yes.
thought it was, not how you thought you were experiencing life, which in some ways is a little anesthetized and, you know, prepackaged into all of these paradigms have that you've inherited, like that everyone's inherited.
Oh, absolutely. But I think there is something that is allowed in art, which is in some art, if you choose it, which is that you don't have to have all the nuance and footnotes, right? I don't have just you don't have to say, and then I bought the booties. When you publish the poem, you can leave it there, right? You can
Yeah,
leave it there and you can live your life outside of the poem. And the poem is great with that as the last line, but the life is not great with that as the last line. And
yeah,
so there's that space.
that's it.
Um,
Because the poem has a stopping point.
right,
The poem ends, the
right.
life continues, presumably.
Right, right. And if we are always sort of worried about like, well, the poem should have this whole, like I never have published anything because I'm still thinking about all of those things. I'm changing my opinion about everything, and thank God. Um, but yeah, it's a whole tricky space. What's on the horizon for you? I know you're teaching a whole bunch. You're teaching for us again in February,
I
which
am.
we're so excited about. And your family's growing, and your dog has shoes,
Yeah,
which is
so many.
ex-
They're like
excellent.
balloons. They're like balloons that you put on his feet.
I just
That's the
I
fun
I, I like animals and clothes, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
teaching a lot. I felt so fortunate to do this emotional historians workshop that started pretty much immediately during in March of 2020. Um, but it's really become a whole uh, system of workshops that has been really wonderful. I teach at Brooklyn College, which I love, but it's been amazing to have a network of students and enough students to have multiple classes that are not tied to an institution and they're not tied to the necessity to put in grades or attend some meeting or report to anyone really other than the people who are taking the workshop, which it kind of forced me as a teacher to ask myself, okay, well, what's the actual class you want to teach? What is the actual setup? What's optimal? Do you want more time? So they're between 2.5 and 3 hours. They're pretty intensive. They're very interactive. Um, and I basically get to like curate set lists of poems and like a little mixtape of poems every single uh, class around themes uh, that I identify, which sometimes they're, regular kind of literary devices that we should learn, but sometimes it's like forcing me to look at work and name something about poems that I love that I haven't been able to do, but I can do it if I can put these like 5 poems together. Then, for instance, it's like, okay, poems that describe the external landscape in a way that makes clear that the external landscape that's being described is actually the internal landscape of the speaker, right? And so the way in which how you describe becomes a description of how you feel, and poems that drive that home, right? So like how you choose to describe the tree says a lot about where you're at emotionally as you're describing the tree, or poems about movement that involve trains. I don't know, there are so many incredible kind of themes
and
to
they're
put together.
and
So
they're 6 weeks or 4 weeks.
they're 6 weeks. Yeah, they're 6 week cycles. If anybody wants to find out about them, you can. It's mostly just on Instagram right now. That's where I launch the workshops, and so I am Jon Sands.
And
Um,
that'll all be in the notes. But thank you for your work in the world and for being such a supporter of CBAW and sharing your work. We're we're just really grateful to have you in the collective.